When this building was dedicated around 1995, they were at a reception, and they made the mistake of saying that they lived on this campus way back when Wayne was a new professor here. And with that, my boss took it over and she said, well, you'd be a perfect one to give us a little lecture on the history of the area and a little tour. And they've been doing it twice a year for over 25 years. I think it's probably about 27, 28 now. So I would like to introduce Wayne Durfee.
Thank you very much, Marianne.
And I will turn off the lights so you can see the screen better.
I'm not going to stand during much of this because a little over a month ago I fell in the garden while I was planting some tomatoes and broke my hip. So it got replaced, and I kind of hobble around a little bit, but it's much better, almost done. They gave me permission to drive the car the other day, so now that I'm free, I can do most anything I want. Well, now my story about South Ferry is that this is a very interesting spot because in the very early history of Rhode Island, this was considered over on the continent. And when the early settlers came into Rhode Island, these folks, well, first of all, let me just say that there's been activity around here with the white men ever since Verrazano came into the area and explored the area, and in 1524. And after that, the Dutch came over. There was a lot of exploration about this new continent that stood in the way between Europe and the Far East. So, of course, they were all looking for a way there, but when they couldn't get around the Americas, they proceeded to exploit some of the facilities, some of the things that were here, including many of the investigating the peoples who were here and all of their societies, the Indians that were here, some friendly and some unfriendly. The Narragansett Indians were quite friendly people, and they had a well-developed culture of agriculture. They were farm people, and they raised a lot of farm materials. And in fact, the headquarters of the Narragansett Indians is believed to have been down at the head of Salt Pond. Some of you may have read about that. It's in the area kind of behind where Stop and Shop Market is, over in that section. But at any rate, after Verrazano had investigated this area and described it a little bit, there was almost 100 years of no settlement. Then all at once in the 1600s, the English began to settle. The Dutch were coming into the area as well. The Dutch had established some trading posts along the south coast, and they had a trading post here on an island in this bay that later people called Dutch Island. Then after that, of course, there was nothing here for a while until the English went into the Plymouth colony, established the Plymouth colony, and then a short time after that, the Massachusetts Bay colony. It was interesting that some of you who know the history of the Indians, the English-speaking Indian that some of the first people in the Plymouth colony discovered, Samoset, and there was another fellow there too, but the other one, I was just thinking about it and it's flipped out of my mind. But at any rate, he had been captured a few years earlier by one of the English captains and taken as a slave and sold in either Spain or Portugal, and made his way, he had escaped and made his way back here. Well, in the meantime, right here between the late teens of the 1600s and the Plymouth colony, there had been the whole area, that many of the Indian settlements had been ravaged by disease. And so when these men came back here, there was no one left. They'd all died off. There were a few of the Wampanoags and a few of the other Indians that occupied the area between Narragansett Bay and Buzzards Bay, just a few of them. So there was actually not too much opposition to the English, although those that were acquainted with the story of the ones that had been captured and taken into slavery, they were pretty hostile, but they soon got over that. Well then, later on in the 1620s, the culture over here changed from the people who had settled because they were trying to escape religious persecution and so on in England. And once they got over here and got up into the period of the 1630s, the same thing was developing here. What we had really was theocracies in the government, and the church and the governments were tied very closely together, and there were many people who were in opposition to that, and among them was Roger Williams, of course, and then there was Anne Hutchinson and more people who were followers of them. And when they were preaching, the Anne Hutchinson group they were called the Antinomians, and the Antinomians they held the belief, there's Christian belief, that you did not need a structured church for salvation. All you needed was your faith, that was sufficient. Well, that wasn't sufficient as far as the leaders of the church were concerned, so they told them to get out, and they would have sent them to prison in England or whatever, but at least Roger Williams came out in 1636 and moved down to the east side of the Seekonk River. And then the next year, when he was informed that he was still within the territory of the Massachusetts colony, he decided he better cross the river and get out of there. So he came across into 1636 and founded Providence. Then there were other followers, just a few years later, of Anne Hutchinson, that were looking for another place to settle because they were unwelcome in the either the Plymouth or the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they were looking around, contacted Roger Williams, and he mentioned Aquidneck Island, a little further south, but they had been planning on going perhaps to Long Island. Well, once they came down and discovered that, they came to Pocasset, which was in the north end of Aquidneck Island in the Portsmouth, present-day Portsmouth, they decided that they would stay there. So Anne Hutchinson and a group, this included Dr. John Clark and William Coddington, and there were several others that moved down there in 1638. And then just 2 years later, or just the following year, Coddington and John Clark went further south on Aquidneck and founded Newport. So then we had, by that time then, there were the two colonies, mainly. There was the colony in Portsmouth, the Pocasset, or the colony there, as well as the one in Providence. Well, then we had another fellow who was a dissident from the group in Portsmouth, and his name was Sam Gorton, and he came across and founded Warwick. Well, he had troubles there too, and I won't get into the details of that, but there was at one time we had Newport, we had Portsmouth, had Warwick, and Providence. These colonies all existed in the 1640s, and Roger Williams was trying to get a compact together. He did get them all united at one time in the 1640s, and then for one reason or another they split up again. But then he and John Clark went to England in attempts to get a charter for Rhode Island so it could stand by itself, because Massachusetts was trying to get everything east of Narragansett Bay, and at the same time the Connecticut colony was trying to get everything west of. which left Rhode Island with nothing but a few islands in the bay. So there was a bit of urgency in trying to get that charter. So it was interesting that I had not heard much of John Clark until I found a book about him and discovered that this John Clark, he was a doctor, and he went to England along with Roger Williams, and actually John Clark was is given credit by some authors as being the actual author of the Charter of Rhode Island. We don't hear much about him. So anyway, they were over in England while the English turmoil was going on, the killing of the king there, and another King Charles going into exile. And there was a lot of turmoil going on in the 1650s. Then finally, the government was reestablished in England, and they did get that charter in 1663. But in the meantime, there was quite a little bit going on over here in Rhode Island as well, in southern Rhode Island, because the fact that we didn't have a charter didn't stop the colonization over here. So we did have some treaties. There were 3 main treaties that covered southern Rhode Island. These were compacts with the Indians. And the first one was the Pataquamscot Purchase. Now that board shows pretty much the Pataquamscot Purchase. And the Pataquamscot Purchase, if you look carefully, goes from, there's Warden's Pond, goes pretty much along the left side of it, and across the north, parts of North Kingstown, a little bit of Exeter, and comes back out almost to the, does come back out to this area of Narrow River. It didn't include this neck of land here, but it did come there to Narrow River. So there's the Pataquamscot Purchase. It was roughly 12 miles square, 140 more or less square miles in it, pretty good sized area, and many of the people in it, of the original proprietors, claimed for themselves in the neighborhood of 7,000 acres, which they subsequently sold off. But if you look at that map closely, you'll see the names of some of the people that were involved in that purchase. Down on the path that goes south of Narrow River, going down here toward Point Judith Neck, all along there was a man named Sewell and another one named Hull. And Hull was involved a great deal with the development of the Narragansett Pacer that I'll talk about a little bit later. Well, then the next year, after the Pataquamscot Purchase, the next year was the Atherton Purchase, and this was 1658. By the way, right at that time, we were busy changing the calendars from the new year went from in March back to January 1. So you'll see things that were done in that period between January and the middle of March. Sometimes they're in one year and sometimes in the other. It doesn't matter too much. It happened. So anyway, the Atherton Purchase is that neck of land there, and it's in 2 parts. This southern part goes up to an area south of Wickford, about to Rome Point, past the Gilbert Stewart place. And then there's another part that jumps over on the north side of the Smith's Castle area, and that's called the north part of the Atherton Purchase. Well, this Humphrey Atherton was an officer, and he got in the British, and he and some others, I'll get into the names of them a little bit further when we go on, but most of them were from the Boston area, and because of that, this purchase area, that long neck of land, was given the name Boston Neck. It was the Indian name for it was Namcook. So at any rate, that was the Atherton Purchase. And then the third one that followed in 1660, I took care of the land, all of the southern part of Washington County, all the way to Connecticut, and that was the Mesquamacut Purchase. I won't get into that too much because it's South Ferry doesn't have much to do with that, but these others were very important to the development of South Ferry. There we are. Okay, this was the first division of the of the Atherton purchase, and you can see the names of some of the people. There was, up in the northern part, Hutchinson, Hudson, and there's a Tinker, Richardson, and Winthrop is the most important one here. He was governor of Connecticut at the time, and the area that became South Ferry was right here. And at that time, among the old roads, the very early roads, we had, as a result of the Pettaquamscot purchase, there was part of it that was over near Warden's Pond that was set aside for the use of the church. And that was called the ministerial part, ministerial lands. And a road was subsequently put in that went from the ministerial lands all the way across to this area. There it is there, Saugatucket Road. And the far end of it is Curtis Corner Road, I think. Curtis Corner Road and Saugatucket Road tied in that ministerial land here to the coast. So then a few years later, these were the three great purchases, you might say, of here in southern Rhode Island. Jamestown was acquired about the same time, in that same period. Then, after these purchases, a great deal of misunderstanding took place apparently with the Indians. Some of the people were beginning to populate the area. They were either buying or renting, using land that had been purchased. But the notion of the ownership of land to the exclusive use of one person was a foreign notion to the Indians. They sold, as far as they were concerned, permission to use the land. This was it. Fine, you could build houses on it, you could do a lot of stuff, but if we're hunting deer, we've got a right to come through and hunt deer or do a variety of things ourselves. And the European concept, apparently was, you buy the land, it's yours, you've got a right to fence it and tell everybody else to keep out. And that meant there was considerable clashing with the Indians, and it finally got up to the point of the King Philip's War, the War of 1675 and 76. And in that war, the Rhode Island militia we didn't have a militia, as I recall, at that time, but the militia of the United Colonies came in, and these United Colonies involved Connecticut and Massachusetts, and they came into Rhode Island. They camped at Smith's Castle and then went on further down to attack the Narragansetts in their home territory in Great Swamp. And of course there was a terrible massacre. It was nothing to be proud of, and Roger Williams would have nothing to do with it. The Indians did not retaliate against him because they knew him and trusted him, but they did retaliate against many of the colonists, people who had settled in this area. They burned their homes and so on. So that was a bad situation that took place there, but it was fairly short. Well, then after that, since the Indians were not providing much of any opposition, then we had settlement of all of these lands, which proceeded quite rapidly. Well, two of the people who had previously been on Prudence Island, two brothers, Smith, John and Jeremiah, John and Jeremiah Smith, decided that they would come to the mainland. They came down and they bought the Winthrop piece of property. And John Smith had the pot above. You can see that road. They developed that road going straight across that property from the area right in here, which now we call Bridgetown, and goes across to the South Ferry. And they came into this area, they bought that land, they developed the ferry slip, and by about 1695, they were providing some ferry service back and forth to Jamestown. This would be South Ferry in here, Dutch Island, and the ferry would run from South Ferry across to Jamestown in here. That would be the west landing of Jamestown. You'd walk across Jamestown, then take another ferry across to Newport, over in here. The settlements at Newport. And at that time, it was customary to name the ferries for their point of origin. So we had, coming here from the Smiths, the ferry that would run across would have been the Narragansett Ferry. This was Narragansett at that time. Narragansett Pier, as a village, didn't even exist. So this was Narragansett, and there was a mailbox, a post office here, established somewhat later. And the two Smiths operated the ferry. Well, we're jumping up here almost 200 years. You see, we're up into the 1857, and with South Ferry, after 200 years, that's the way it has. That's what you're looking at there as far as roads in the area are concerned. Here was Saugatucket Road coming up from the Warden Pond area. The Post Road has been developed now, coming up to Wakefield, coming up to this community right here is Tower Hill. And Tower Hill is where there's a power equipment place and one house there. And that's about it right now. But at that time, it was quite a little village. And so you come up there and go down Torrey Road, down to at the base. This is now Middlebridge Road, and you would go along the river, cross at Bridgetown, and then take the road that the Smiths had developed and go all the way to South Ferry. Now in that road, just about halfway across, this one, by the way, going north and south, is the old Boston Neck Road. And you can see that even in 1857, there was no Boston Neck Road as such. That was the old Boston Neck Road. But at any rate, when the Smiths developed it, John developed one end of the road, and Jeremiah developed the other end. And right in here, you'll see a little crook in the road. And when you go out from here, going back to the main road, you'll see the road makes a turn, and that's where you go from one man's section of the road over to the other one. Kind of interesting, but you have to look for it to even notice it nowadays. Now, getting along a little bit into the era of all of the plantations that were developed in the area at the time, and among their products, one of them was the Narragansett Pacer. And the Narragansett Pacer became very popular because of its gait. And those of you who are acquainted with trotters or pacers, you know that the trotting horse would walk, if you take a look at your dog or cat, that way the opposite legs, the foreleg and the hind leg on the opposite sides are synchronized. So you have that kind of a gait. And if you were to get on your hands and knees, the way you would walk would be like that. The opposite, just for your own balance. But the pacer, the foreleg and the hind leg on the same side operate together. So it gives you kind of a rocking motion. You're going from left to right on both legs, foreleg and hind leg on one side and then foreleg and hind leg on the other. So it's kind of a rocking motion. And some of the old books say you could even go to sleep on a horse like that. And they were very popular for a riding horse, but they were not a good carriage horse. Well, they were a major crop for some of the early planters, and they were sold to plantations down in the West Indies. And finally, all the last of the brood mares in the early 1800s were sold off, and the whole breed disappeared. How close that is to the Tennessee walking horse, I'm not sure. It's an unusual gait, at least. Now, this next one is the plantation house of the Robinson family. The Roland Robinson came here about 1700 and built this house in 1710. And if you're interested in these old homes, it's a beautiful house. That picture is not too old. It's one of the recent ones. As you go back toward the main road, going west from here, the first crossing that you come to, it's about half a mile from here, is the old Boston Neck Road. Make a right turn there, and you'll see the old plantation house. It's just about half a mile up that road. And a beautiful place, and it's now owned by the Hazard family. Now, this next one, and this goes back to those early days too, of the glebe. This was the home of a very prominent minister of the Anglican Church in North Kingstown, actually. This was, and the glebe was located along the river, not far from where the river road, or the narrow river road, comes up and crosses this road. This was Bridgetown, the Bridgetown Road, up just about a mile from here. That road comes up, crosses the present Bridgetown Road, and continues on as a narrow lane, pretty much going north for about half or three-quarters of a mile. Then it turns and by the URI boathouse and turns and comes up to Route 1. But the glebe was owned by this Dr. McSparran. This picture was taken pretty much from the area where the lookout tower is located at the corner of, on McSparran Hill, the corner of Route 138 and Route 1. I think there might be a placard, or there used to be, a sign there saying to Hannah's Rock. And that was the area where Hannah, who was Hannah Robinson, went to look for her husband coming by sea, and she could look out and see pretty much to the ocean. The pre-Revolutionary War period was quite interesting too, in the turnover of the various ferries. The first ferries that I mentioned here were John and Jeremiah Smith. About the mid-1700s, 1740 more or less, the state was having problems with the ferries because the ferry owners had to change their rates, and the state didn't want them to. So finally the state said, well, we'll take over then. So they took over all the ferries in the state, and there were a lot of them. Well, you can imagine what happened there. That lasted about 4 or 5 years. And the state then became convinced that they couldn't run ferries as well as ferry people could run ferries. So they turned around and they sold the ferries again. This ferry here went to John Franklin, and at that same time, this had been about 1745 or so, by that time another ferry north, that's the reason this one was called South Ferry, because there was a North Ferry that had been developed from Jamestown, pretty much in the area where the Verrazano Bridge is. Came across from Jamestown to the beach, pretty much where Plum Beach is. So that ferry operated for a while. That was Abel Franklin that ran that one for a brief period. Then he also was the caretaker of the first lighthouse at the end of Jamestown. Well, then by the 1770s, when we got into the Revolution and problems associated with that, the British, of course, occupied all of Aquidneck Island, and they stripped it clean of no trees or anything else because they had troops there. The Hessian troops were there, and that's a long story that has been documented pretty well by Walter Schroeder. Some of you may know his book on the Hessians in Aquidneck Island. It's quite an interesting book. Well then, and during the Revolution, there were many raids on over here on this side because they had stripped the island of just about all of its resources So they were making raids over here on the mainland. Well, then finally, after the Revolution, then things settled down. The Franklins still owned the ferry. They rebuilt the docks here that had been mostly destroyed or very heavily damaged by the British. And so they continued with the ferry business until the late 1700s. In about 1790 or so, they built an inn, a tavern and an inn here. And that one, that was in 1792. And a little bit later, by this time, the land associated with the ferry had been developed a great deal. There was a farm here, and with it turned into about a 100-acre farm, 105 acres, more or less, that were developed here. Then the ferry service and the farm were sold in the 1790s to a man named Gardner. Another fellow named Cottrell actually ran the ferries. And only a few years after that, about in the 1820s, now we're getting up into the modern era here, there was a fellow named Potter, Ezekiel Potter. I may be wrong there, but at any rate, it was Potter, whose son, JBM Potter, became much more involved with the development here at South Ferry. So now, when Potter, it didn't change very much under Potter until about the 1820s. And in the 1820s, a family came here that had been building boats, the Saunders family. Some of you may have heard of them. They had been building seafaring boats, various sizes of boats, in a variety of the estuaries along the coast, from Westerly all the way up to this area. And they had a boatyard at the foot of Torrey Hill. As you come down the hill from Tower Hill, you go right straight, and in that area there was a boatyard. There was also a training ground for the Revolutionary War, for the militia of ours during the Revolution. But in about 1820 or so, the Saunders family came over here. Oh, by the way, when they were building boats along Narrow River, they had built some in the upper lake at Narrow River, but there are sandbars in the river, as you know. So to get over that, they built good-sized vessels, and guess what they used for a keel in them? A centerboard. They were the first ones, as far as we know, to build good-sized vessels with a centerboard that they could pull up, go over the sandbars, or at least at high tide, and good-sized vessels, very shallow draft. So they built vessels of that type. Then they came here about 1820 and developed a shipyard here. And during that time, in about the 1840s, 1835, Potter, this Judge Potter, he was from Kingston, by the way, and he also owned the property over in Uskapog, the Uskapog Mill. But at any rate, his son, JBM Potter, came here, and he teamed up with another ship owner, and they decided that they were going to build a mill. So they did. And here, this was a picture that was drawn up at that time with the South Ferry in the 1850s. This was really about the heyday of the South Ferry. They had built, steam power was coming into widespread use. They no longer had to have the water power of a mill, of a stream or river, so they could develop it with steam. And here you can see There was the ship's chandlery for the outfitting ships that were just being built, or others that were customers could get outfitted here. There was the Morris Inn and Post Office. There was an inn. This was a general store down here. There was an inn up there. Here you've got a stables where horses could be left while you take the ferry. And here was the mill and the mill houses along here. So there's quite a variety of buildings that were built in the 1850s. That's supposed to be J.B.M. Potter's house, and there's a little church up on the hill that they built for the community. This should show the Eatons, Joseph Eaton's General Store, and here's a list of all of the things I have printed out. You can't read it all, but all of the different kinds of provisions that would be found here in the ship's chandlery. And here a little shallow area where boats can come in for outfitting, and you can take a look at those later from this place. The mill is actually over in this area. Here we have Captain Eaton's store and the Eaton family, and you can see the inn up here behind the store. And there we have William Simpson. He was the foreman, the base dyer, the boss dyer at the South Ferry Mill for this period from 1859 to 65. And things went downhill about then. Several things happened in the evolution of this area. One big thing that was happening was that the steam that they used in the mill could be put on wheels and put on tracks and called a railroad. About that time, around 1840 or so, the railroad went in. It may be on that map over there, I'm not sure. But the railroad went in and made it unnecessary to use brave the hazards of the ocean, Point Judith, and all of this with your boats going back and forth. You could just go directly from Westerly to Providence. It came up, of course, from New York to Westerly, and then Stonington Railroad is the one I was trying to think of, and went all the way to Providence, and then you'd had to make a change, but could go on to Boston. But the railroad era was really coming in, and that made transportation of all of the farm goods, the agricultural products, and so on, the mill products that from the Hazard Mill down here in Peacedale, all of these kinds of things could get on rail with very rapid transit. So the area down here began to go downhill. Another thing that was happening was that the mill was producing slave cloth, or very cheap, a cheap type of a cotton cloth, and we had a civil war coming. And the Civil War pretty much wiped out the whole area down here. The transportation had changed. There was no longer use for the mill, and it became, it just went downhill also. J.B.M. Potter went into the military and never came back. He wasn't killed. He just went on with the troubles with the Indians in the West after the Civil War. He was an officer in the Army. And so he sold everything to Eaton, all of his share, to the Eatons in about the mid 1864 or so, right in the middle of the Civil War. But then, with the loss of their business, of the mill product, the whole mill began to go downhill. And eventually, Mrs. Eaton sold the whole property to a fellow from New York. Let's see if and we're moving up to another period here. Okay, that was the old, one of the old mill buildings, the powerhouse, which was later used by the military here. In that period, from the Civil War to about 1900, there was a report commissioned by Congress to look into the security of our coastline, the coastal cities. This was called the Endicott Report. And as a result of that, they recommended the development of fortifications to protect Narragansett Bay. And one was to have been here, another one directly across the bay, the West Passage here, and another one over on Jamestown. Of course, Fort Adams was already there. So with that recommendation, perhaps knowing about that recommendation, a man came along and purchased all of the property that Mrs. Eaton had owned, all of the remains of the 105 or 165 acres, I think it was at the time, and he bought it as speculation, and he bought it for about $25,000. A few years later, in the mid-1890s, the federal government, acting on this Endicott report, purchased a 25-acre piece of that property. They purchased from this fellow, they purchased it for 65,000 acres. That was only $65,000, I'm sorry. And that was only 25 acres that they got. He still retained all the rest of it. So that was the beginning of the fortifications here. And later just a few years later, in the early 1900s, 1901, this area was called, the military reservation was called Fort Kearny. And this was named for a brigadier general that was killed in the Civil War. So various people have changed the name of Kearny. I have kept it, and in everything that I have, his name is listed officially, Kearny. Other people who have written about it, and many other documents that are written about it, have put an extra E in it. That is, I prefer to use the man's name. Before Fort Kearny developed, this was the Jamestown steam ferry, and the ferries had undergone considerable change. Finally, the last ferry to operate out of here was in the 1890s, and the Saunders family had moved their shipbuilding business north to an area along the shore that became known as Saunderstown. So they were building vessels there as well. They had to develop shipyard there, and they developed an inn and the ferry service. They developed a ferry service and requested that the Jamestown Newport ferry would stop up there instead of here at South Ferry. So they accommodated them, and the last ferry here was about in 1899. Now, the church that was built in the 1850s, here we've got it was more or less derelict in the period after World War I. I didn't mention this before, but Fort Kearny was built and developed for World War I. It was actually built and garrisoned. It was built I think it was named in 1901. They started building it in 1904. They had a garrison there by 1906, and it was garrisoned all during World War I. Then after World War I, they actually used the church for a bit for a canteen and entertainment for the soldiers who were based here, coastal artillery during World War I. Then after World War I, everything just faded out. All of the guns that had been here were taken away. But first of all, I'm going to jump ahead here to the South Ferry Church. This shows that after the hurricane of '38, and I think most people would agree that that was about ready for the bulldozer to come in. Well, they didn't. They turned around and they rebuilt it. In the 1850s, you've got the 1850s, and then after the 38 hurricane, there it was. The steeple was inside the church. I have no idea whatever happened to the bell, but at least the steeple was rebuilt, and there's the church as it is today. Now I'm going to go back a bit to to Fort Kearny and its development. There with Fort Kearny in 1951. Over here in 51, this would have been Battery Armistead, and then you had Battery Cram and Battery French. Well, on Battery French, the circles show the base of the guns, and the base of these center ones was later used for the nuclear reactor. Here you can see the barracks buildings where the accompanying the soldiers at the time, and there was building A, B, C, and D, and it was in building B where my wife and I lived in the first year after we were married. By that time, the university had acquired the property and had renovated the barracks into living quarters. Let's see what we've got. There are the barracks buildings. This would have been A, B, and C, and we lived right in that apartment there. Very nice. You could look out our living room window and look down the bay to Beavertail. Very nice place. And the very spacious apartment that we had, that would be the living room window, and my wife, and the very spacious kitchen, water heater, and so on. There was another bedroom about here in relation to the kitchen area. But they were very nice, and but they were awfully expensive. I think our apartment here cost us $25 a month, and with a kerosene oil heater, potbelly stove, pot burner rather. Now I'm going to shift here to show you some of the guns that were used early on. This would have been a 6-inch gun that would have been used in Battery Cram, the 2 guns in Battery Cram, as well as the 4 in Battery French. This was before World War I. And here you can see the gun up in position. And they had a very heavy counterweight, a lead counterweight on them, so that when that gun was fired, the recoil from the fire would push the barrel back in such a way that it would come down into this area and would lock in place where it could be opened then and be loaded with a charge, a shell, and then the powder charge from the magazine, which was over to one side there. So these were the disappearing guns. They were 6-inch guns. See if I have anything else. The ones in French were smaller guns. Oh, now this shows the submarine net going across from Wetheral across to Newport. By the 1950s, this was the way the Narragansett Bay looked, or the URI facilities. That was the remains of the old inn in the era of when JBM Potter and when the mill was operating. The inn was up there. The Eaton's store would have been down at a little bit lower level, and here just in front of it. And there you can see some of the barracks building. In 1951, you see there's no Coastal Institute over here or EPA lab. There's the Mosby Center that was built right after the 1938 hurricane. At that time, by that time, Dr. Fish and his wife, Marie Fish, had developed the Narragansett Marine Lab, which was like a 2-car garage located down at the lower level. It would have been down here, very close to sea level. And the 38 hurricane wiped it out. The man who was working in there at the time, a graduate student, he was working on his PhD degree at that time. His name was Dr. Zinn. Later he was PhD, but his name was Don Zen. Some of you maybe somebody here who knows him. At any rate, he was working on his advanced degree and everything was gone, just rubble. Well, he came over the next day after the 38 hurricane and was poking around in the rubble, and he found all his stuff. His file cabinets were all tipped over and into rubble, but he found it, and that saved him, so he got his degree. Now, then later on, in the 1950, 51, at that time, the last use of the, you might say, the ferry slip, was in transporting ledge material. These were huge boulders from a ledge over on Rose Hill. Really, it was a quarry. They were quarrying granite there to put on a barge for the rebuilding or for the building of destroyer piers over in Middletown. So they were, at that time, they were trucking and that was the last use of the ferry slip. They were trucking this material to Middletown. The area as it appears, let's see if I've got it here. Yeah, as it appears today. Here's there's the Mosby building. The old building is gone from there, the old inn and officers' quarters and so on that appeared there. By the way, there's something I have left out, and I should mention it here because it was quite important. At the end of World War II, if you remember, the conflict in Europe ended in May of 1945. And before that time, in 1943, there was the great battle with the Germans in North Africa. And as a result of that, this was our first, the U.S. troops going into Africa way before the 1944 invasion of Europe. In 43, our forces went into North Africa, and the British forces were in Egypt, and they managed to sandwich Rommel's German forces in between, and Rommel had to get out. And as he did, he got out, but many of his troops wound up as prisoners. Something like 370,000 Germans that we had from the Battle of North Africa. So who could take 370,000 German prisoners? England couldn't take them. None of our allies could take them. The U.S. took them. So they brought them over here and had them in something like 370 or so German prisoners of war camps. And there they were languishing until the end of the war. And there was a lot of bad stuff going on in these prisoners of war camps. And as the war began to terminate, they decided that our people needed to re-educate and train these Germans who were all going to be going back to Germany. We didn't want to send a whole bunch of the Nazi prisoners and just dump them in over there without some kind of training about government, security, and all of this type of thing. So what happened was they brought some of the prisoners here to Fort Kearny, and they developed a newspaper here that was printed for distribution to all of the German prisoner of war camps. And at the same time, or a little bit later, they developed a school for government, trained people for government and security and police forces. The government one was at Fort Getty, and then the security one took place over at Fort Wetherill. And these were brief 60-day, 2-month, quick learning schools that were developed by our government at that time. See, and because the war was already over in Europe in 45, so they developed these schools in the summer of 45 and then on into the spring of 46 to get all of these people out of here. So that's what happened in that time. And then right after the last ones left in 46, then they URI acquired the place and turned it into housing for graduate students, and then later came the School of Oceanography. I don't think I have anything more to say. I do have, but it'll take more and more time, so. I'll be glad to answer any questions if you want to take the time to ask them. So, I will not be able to accompany you on your walking tour, but you're certainly welcome to take the little walking tour. It's anchored right about in that area, and right in there you will see a concrete slab that's about the size of two of these tables right here. A heavy concrete slab with a heavy ring. It's a 8 or 10 inch diameter ring with iron in it is at least an inch in diameter, and that provided the anchor for this end of the submarine cable. Well, it wasn't anti-submarine really, it was anti-torpedo boat cable that went across, and it was kept on the surface because the intent of that cable was to rip the guts out of any torpedo boat that would try to come up and hit Quonset, because Quonset was brand new at that time, and from this West Passage you could just shoot up through here with a high-speed torpedo boat and get anything that might be at Quonset. So it was to protect from that. Let's see. So, anybody, any more questions? Yes, the Indian sachems, and I could try to pronounce some of them for you. Koganquinaquanch was one of them, or something like that. Anyway, they're Indian names, and they were the ones who sold these property rights, or the rights to use. And
when you say they sold it, how was that property for sale evidence? Was it on a document? Was it written?
yes, it was written up, but signed. The Indians had their own signs. It was written up in our languages. I have not seen them, but these were the treaties that were undertaken at that time. The proprietors from Newport, as I said, there were several. There was a man named Hull, Sewell, Mumford. Mumford was an old name. They were among the earliest ones. Then later on, Benedict Arnold was one of them. These were all proprietors who were buying the stuff, buying this property from the Indians. And they used, in many cases, they used wampum, strings of wampum that were quite valuable. And some of the currency that was used, that gets into another thing. They used Spanish currency many times. Pieces of 8 were commonly used as currency, because we didn't have our own dollars until after the Revolution. We were using the British shilling and shillings and crowns and all that stuff, as well as the Spanish pieces of 8 that were in use. Anybody else? Yes.
I've heard that George Washington rode a Narragansett pacer down South Ferry, took the ferry over to Jamestown, Newport. Is that true, or do you know anything about that?
He rode a horse. Yeah, I'm not sure whether Washington had Narragansett pacers or not. He might have, because they were a very nice riding horse, and they were very popular at that time. I think I have read that account too, that Washington rode a Narragansett pacer. But Washington was a very big man, as I recall, and the Narragansett pacer was a small horse. But whether the two of them got along very well, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, they were a nice horse. Anything else? Okay.